Welcome, Dr. Katz. Vikki is an associate professor at the Rutgers University in the communication department. Did I get that right, Vikki?
You did. You did.
Okay. So ever since I've known Vikki, she's been very, very interested in a very under-researched area, but it's a core pillar of what we do, which is what working class families and immigrant families, how they adopt and integrate technology into their lives, into their routines, and how does technology change the fabric of the family. And the thing that when I first met Vikki, what really intrigued me was like what she was focusing on, what role children play in families which may not be that familiar with English, and how the children are the translators and carry so much of the burden. And that perspective was very new to me. So Vikki, I'm so glad to have you here today.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. And for the people who are listening, I've known Tara since we were graduate students at USC and realized we had a shared interest in what families could do with each other. And I mean, if I look at pictures, and we looked like two kids, and we aren't anymore. But it's what a joy to see how you've grown this wonderful organization, and what a treat to be back, even virtually, to chat with you.
Likewise, Vikki. I mean, I've been seeing some of the research, but the study that you just have completed, and also the comparative study, was one that I read with so much interest. How I love the term also underconnected families what have they been experiencing during COVID? So for the listeners, I want to tell a little bit about the survey, which was with working class families across the U.S. And of course, we know so much that there's lack of access, things like that. But I also want to focus on the positives, because I think we're all tired of hearing all the bad things. And the positive that Vikki found was that parents did gain something out of this mess, and they learned more about their children's schooling, strengths, weaknesses, and a deeper respect, appreciation for teachers. So Vikki, I know in your report you talk about how should we not squander these gains as families are adjusting to going back in person. My worry is that we've been a little bit too tired. We still are tired. But how should we not lose what we gained, the little what we gained?
So let me start just by telling you in 2 minutes what we did and how we did it, so that your listeners can, judge how relevant it is to what they're doing. So this was a study in a collaboration between Rutgers and New America, think tank in DC, with a consortium of funders. And what it did was follow up on a survey we'd done in 2015, when very few people were that interested in how digital inequality was affecting children. And that was a national survey after we interviewed about 300 parents and children in 3 states about how technology adoption and integration into their lives was affecting them. And we focused that survey on lower income families, parents raising kids in the bottom half of incomes in the United States, in Spanish and English. And the thing that makes it different is we did it by phone. We did not use the internet to survey families, which is what most studies do now. We think that if you're going to study digital inequality and unequal access to tech, you can't use the tech to contact families. And so when the pandemic hit, we thought we were in a unique position to look at the pandemic in context and see how digital inequality might be evolving or resolving in this time that, we've beaten the word unprecedented to death, but it was unprecedented. But it was also building on experiences. Everyone came into the pandemic in a different place. We had a better sense of that than other people. And so we repeated the survey. We did focus groups as well in Detroit, in Pittsburgh, and Santa Clara County in the Bay Area. But we surveyed 1,000 families, again, same demographic profile, and we could compare over time. So we could look at what was unique about the pandemic, but we could also look at what happened over time. We surveyed families in March and April of 2021, which was like this unique moment in the pandemic because we were a year into the experience, and a year is an easy thing to reflect back, right? It's why we make New Year's resolutions, I think. You can think back on a whole year. And because of vaccines, we felt like we could look forward to a school year that might look quite different. Delta was not yet part of our lives. And so one of the things that we asked, because there's been so much coverage of what has been difficult about this year, and rightfully so, But every difficult situation that any of us have in our lives, we have opportunities, good and bad, to learn from them. We wanted to see if in all of the challenges, in all of the suffering, we could also identify what families learned. And so we asked parents to think back on a year and think, do they know their child's strengths and weaknesses as a learner better than they did a year ago? Do they know what their kids learning in school better than they did a year ago? Do they feel more confident communicating with teachers? And do they feel more confident helping with homework? And we found that across the board that was the case. The biggest gains were knowing their child's strengths and weaknesses as a learner. And for a lot of parents, that created a deeper respect for what children and teachers do together in a classroom, because they could understand the limits of what they could do at home. But the biggest gains across all four of those learning measures we saw amongst families of color, families where parents are foreign born, and parents who are raising kids below the federal poverty level. So the parents who've had the hardest time connecting with schools saw the biggest gains in what they were able to learn in a year that gave them a disproportionate number of challenges. And we think that's a bright spot that educators can build on, even though we're tired, even though we're, looking at a year where Delta may shut down a classroom or a building for a week or two. Parents and teachers can build on having built better relations out of necessity last year. And our study shows that they can build on that the most with the parents who they'd had the hardest time connecting with before.
And do you know why that was that group had that?
I have my suspicions, and I think that you and I can probably, in an anecdotal way, attest to this, right? You and I are well-educated, professional women. We feel like we had less access to teachers in a remote environment. We can see how our access and understanding might have even decreased this year. But that's because you and I enjoy an unusual amount of access in normal times. What we heard from parents in focus groups is things like, I can attend a PTA meeting now because it's online. I can take a break in my shift and I can log in for half an hour while I have dinner, as opposed to it being something I can never do because it would mean that I have to change a shift, right? So there are ways in which, as we start crawling back towards something that resembles normal life, we shouldn't throw out all of the virtual abilities to meet and connect, because for some families, especially those who have trouble with transport, who have inflexible work shifts, there have been gains this year in terms of how they felt that they could be engaged. And we need to make sure we don't throw that out as we move
That's a
back
great
towards
insight.
normal.
I think I may have missed that in the report, or maybe you're saying like, okay, this is your hunch, right? But I think that's a really, really
No,
good
we
point.
heard it. We heard it in the focus groups, but it wasn't something we could ask about in a survey, and
I
so
see.
it's not in the report. You didn't miss it, but it's definitely something we heard, and it's something we've heard from community organizations that we partnered with to get their insights before we fielded the survey, that they were hearing from families that they serve on the ground around the country. So we got to do something about that. As
Yeah, I
we
think
sort of keep thinking about this, as we get so excited to throw some of this stuff away and turn off Zoom and everything else, it's a tool. Let's use it mindfully and carefully so that we can improve access where it has.
Yeah, I think we heard that from the libraries as well, that they
Mm-hmm.
were able to bring in experts, especially technical experts, that they would not never have been able to bring into their
Sure.
communities. So I think that's a key thing to keep in mind. So Vikki, I think I know you've been. It's an interesting position, like for me too, like talking to educators and others as we are all navigating a home environment as well as your own work, which
Mm-hmm.
kind of ties in, right? So I'm wondering, how has your own journey been as a researcher and a parent? I mean, you've been reflecting and comparing, um, and throughout this pandemic.
It's been an interesting time to be someone who researches this because something that for most people, I've been doing this for 10, 12 years. For some educators have always thought this was going to be a major concern. And some thought, well, this is nice to have, but we have more urgent problems. The pandemic hit and this became the problem. Do kids and families have adequate internet access? Do they have a computer that works? Because it became the only way to have an education. And so it's been a very busy year. And yeah, it's been set against recognizing that my own very privileged, very fortunate 6-year-old doesn't learn this way. Even though he's got perfect internet access and a device that works and a parent that can sit with him, he's 6. They're not developmentally meant to learn from a screen. They learn in a classroom. That's what kindergarten is supposed to be, learning to share. You can't share virtually at that age. And so I think it has been an interesting meditation for me, both on how privileged my own family is and yet how hard it still is, but also that a very good physical lesson in the limits of technology for learning. That's part of what I hope we'll all take into this as we keep moving forward. There's been so much talk for so many years about how technology can transform education. It also has its limits. And there are things that we simply must do in person, especially for our young kids in terms of relationship building. And that's really what families in the survey were prioritizing for this next school year. They wanted their kids building relationships with peers, with teachers again, that was first priority. Reading was their second priority, but their top priority for their children in this new school year was socio-emotional connection and learning.
I think one thing that I liked seeing in your report was that yes, access to internet has increased over the 5 years, but the story is so much beyond access, and I think that's something that we fight on a daily basis with partners and funders, because I feel providing access and a device is a very tangible problem, so people jump into that because you have a number to go for. But the counter to that, I keep telling people, is that just because you have broadband access and a device doesn't mean you're spending your time learning how to build something. You're watching Netflix and YouTube, right? So it's not what is needed is that mentor or the human in the loop who's going to actually inspire you and teach you. And so I think that network is very much messier to build, right? Especially into communities that are under-resourced. Did you want to say anything to that, Vikki?
Yeah. I mean, I think what you're pointing to is the human infrastructure that's a lot harder to build than the digital, especially right now.
And nobody wants to touch it.
No, because it's hard and it's expensive and it's long term. That's the real investment, right? I mean, Congress is currently debating the $65 billion worth of digital infrastructure. It's the biggest investment we've seen ever. It's not going to be all we need. And so questions that school districts, community orgs have always asked, federal government has always asked, do you have broadband internet access? Do you have a computer? Yes or no? We found on those measures huge gains in 6 years. And some of that's an artificial bump, right? Because schools sent home hotspots. Telecom companies were giving subsidized broadband
in the Detroit area, right?
In Detroit, but across the board. I mean, schools sending home computers. So there was an artificial bump in access, but still 20 percentage point increase in home broadband across the board. And for immigrant Hispanic families, which were the group that had the least home broadband in 2015, 35%, they're at 75%. I mean, that's it's a good story. 91% of families have a computer at home, but those questions aren't enough, because what we found was access has increased enormously. The proportion of families that are underconnected didn't budge. The number of families who say their internet's too slow, for example, whose computers aren't working well or they have to share them with too many people. Their internet connection's been cut off in the last year at least once because they couldn't pay for it, or they're using a mobile phone for internet or as their primary device. Those are ways of being underconnected. You can't do all the things you need to, and your access is inadequate for what you need and inconsistent for what you need. And so even before we get to your excellent point about what people need to fully participate in a digital environment, those mentors and inspirations, first you have to have consistent and adequate access. And I would argue that the access questions, the yes-no access questions on broadband and computers, don't even get us to the starting block of what you're talking about. How are we going to resolve being underconnected? We can't treat it as a one and done. It's not handing somebody a hotspot and a computer and saying, off you go. It's not enough. You need people who check in with them and make sure that things are working correctly. You need that family knows exactly where to go when the computer stops working or when they can't pay internet this month, so that they can resolve it quickly and it doesn't become an ongoing problem. And we really, really need to be on top of that in every district this year. Given that we're going to probably have these quick flips to remote learning, we need to know which families need not just here's a hotspot and a computer, but that affirmative check-in from staff to make sure that they're really online and doing okay.
The point about devices not working resonated with me very strongly. And um, I'll just give an anecdotal example because I think bad devices, one of the things that I learned was we ran a lot of live sessions. Just because you have a laptop that can tune in doesn't mean its audio is high quality. And so that
Mm-hmm.
means that the child will not be able to sort of raise her hand and participate in the class because of the audio thing. There was one Google executive who tuned into our meeting once, and he was using his child's Chromebook, and
Hmm.
and it was so startling to see hear how bad the audio was. And I think it was the first time, and his child was very young, so she wasn't even able to complain to him. And so
She didn't even know what she was missing.
Exactly, because and so that to us was such an interesting moment where okay, everybody needs high quality devices, and then just I'm sure like in the beginning of the year, trying to get your children and other children on, you realize how frustrating. And I saw in your report, right, like
Yeah.
you have a mobile phone, but it doesn't log into this platform. So all of those elements are the messy piece that I think yeah is work for us. One thing I mean, and I know it's a comment, because we work globally and also, I mean, of course, across different
Yeah.
cultures, what we heard was that even though there may be a device, there may be time, girls actually get much less time on the device because with the pandemic, like all the chores are falling on the girls.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, like, I didn't see a gender dimension in your survey, but I
Mm-hmm.
wonder if it came through in your focus group somehow.
Sure. I mean, we know in every country, in every culture, when there's more care work to do, we know who does it. And we know who that puts behind. And so we did not see gender dynamics amongst, which child parents were focusing on, but I don't think that means it's not there.
Mm,
Also, because we were looking at kids 3 to 13. So some
mm,
of those kids are simply too young to be having their energies diverted. We know that this falls primarily on kids starting in middle childhood and up. Um, there's no question it falls more on those kids. Any lower income family with multiple children, it's the oldest child who's playing that third or second parent caregiver sorts of role.
mm,
That's true in normal times. And I think that the pandemic has been a lesson in how inequality gets accelerated under
mm.
extreme conditions. So, I mean, the gender dynamics of this from early childhood up through parents, right? I mean, the exodus of women from the workforce is not a choice. It's a
Yeah,
forcing out. And if we can see that in a country as sort of so-called developed as the United States, we know exactly what we're seeing, in countries like where you grew up and in South Africa where I grew up, right? So, while this work is U.S. focused. We've talked about this before. Anyone who's an immigrant does their work with an eye to where they're doing it and an eye to where they come from. I mean, Africa's seen this in enormous numbers. I know you and your partners know this as well. That gender dynamic, all that hard work we've done to create more equity in education. This has, if this keeps going, it sets us back a long way on that. We've got to
for
we're
sure.
going to be a few steps back to move forward. Yeah.
I think one thing that I did hear from some of the partners was that having the online access did give a window into the families that was not normally there for educators. So you could
Yes.
actually see what is the child's life like, and it's chaotic, right? And so you some of these things you can't even imagine in picture, but the online classes are providing that
Can
picture.
I tell you something super interesting about that window? It went both ways.
Mm.
So we had parents in focus groups who told us they would sit, especially with their youngest children, the early childhood ages, the preschool ages, and see what the teachers were doing, the singing and the clapping and the counting together in games, and realize that they've been doing things that they don't think of as teaching their children
Oh,
pre-literacy
interesting.
skills, but now they could see the teachers were doing it and they started feeling more confident about their own
Mm,
abilities to guide their children. So for years and years, I mean, I'm an advisor for PBS for their Ready to Learn their early childhood programming. For years, we've been batting around like, how parents respond to being told you're your child's first teacher, because for a lot of parents with limited education, they don't feel qualified to be a teacher. They got an insight into what teachers do this year, and they thought,
For the younger
I
at
do
least, yeah.
that. Yeah, but that's a good start, right? I
Yeah,
mean,
for
that's the
sure, for
beginning of
sure.
a trajectory for those kids, and a lot of those younger kids have older siblings. That confidence carries.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so those windows into the home were also a window into the classroom. There's a lot of interesting sort of silver linings I think we can build on from that too.
Yeah. I think trust building, right? Like you have some transparency
Always.
into both worlds. So along the lines, I think some of the things on your report was like how parents, the children were also teaching the parents how to use and navigate technology. I think in our programs, we've really tried to emphasize the parents' role as a co-learner, and especially for mothers.
Hmm.
And they come in because they want a better program, better educational experience for their child, but then they realize they themselves can contribute and learn. So I'm curious if you saw, like you're saying, increase in confidence and self-efficacy. Did you see anything along those lines, around the use of technology and sort of intriguing parents as learners themselves?
Sure. Unfortunately, given that we had limited time to ask
Right.
parents questions in a survey, you always end up cutting out things that you wish you could have asked. But in both surveys, we asked questions about how parents and children help each other to learn about technology and
Mm,
then with technology as a tool, and how siblings do it. Because
mm,
there's been some focus on the cross generational
mm-hmm.
learning. We leave out siblings so
Yep.
much, and
Yep.
siblings can be such powerful learners together. And so we saw very high levels of engagement amongst family members around tech in 2015. Not surprisingly, they're even higher in 2021.
Mm-hmm.
But to the point that, more than half of the parents with kids 10 to 13 say that they help their kids with tech as much as their kids help them.
Mm-hmm.
It's an even
Mm-hmm.
exchange of these expert and learner roles. It's
Mm-hmm.
super powerful stuff. And that's true across the board. It becomes even more powerful when you're looking at parents who don't have a college
Mm-hmm.
education
Mm-hmm.
or who are immigrants to the US. And we know, I know from my own prior work, in those households, it's very likely to be mom and the kids that are doing that
Yeah.
together. And so, this is the kinds of fluid exchange that's mom is a much more active participant in a lot of the time than dad is, and that benefits everybody. Um, so yeah, no, it's the looking at the family as a learning system is always a good way to uncover family strengths and assets we might otherwise overlook.
And I think that's something we want to dig into over the next coming years, where how does this role contribute to the resilience of the individual, the family unit, and then more
Mhm.
broadly, the community, however you define it loosely. And I think we've been digging into this, but whenever you empower women and minority groups to adopt new technologies, that automatically translates into sort of resilience, right? Like to, so I think
Mhm.
I would be curious to, I don't know, maybe do some work together in
Yeah.
the coming years. So we only have 6 more minutes, and I have so many more questions. So I think we're going to have to choose a little bit here. Um, so I was reading something that, of course, we are more connected, but technology also results in a feeling of being more disconnected because
Mhm.
social media can be like the worst form of
Mhm.
nourishment. So, what are your thoughts on how we build on the positives of what technology has to offer,
Yeah.
and better welcome immigrant families, displaced families?
I think uh, it starts with all of us as individuals. You point to social media making us feel that we go to it for a sense of connection and we come away feeling more isolated. It's like the Phantom Toll Booth, the book we read when we were kids. It's like subtraction stew. You should eat it when you're full. You'll be hungry when you're done. Um, that's kind of that's kind of what it feels like. But I think the question that we don't ask nearly enough, both for our own technology engagement or social media engagement, and for others, is how do we feel when we use it?
Mm,
What there's a feeling that draws us to it in the first place, and then it's checking in with yourself while you're using it and saying, "Am I feeling better or worse?" And when you're done, do you feel better or worse? And if it's making you feel worse,
mm,
start doing less of it. And
yeah,
I know that sounds silly, but
it's so
so much
simple.
but so much of how we can sort of manage our own engagement with tech, and understand it more as a tool that we wield than something that has power over us,
Mm.
is about checking in with those kinds of feelings and moving away from it, especially in such a conflict ridden world where there is so much conflict to view online. You can start seeing the world as a much less hospitable place than
Hmm.
it often is if you just close the device and walk outside.
Yeah.
There is so much we can look at it as to like suffering in the world. We just, if you turn on anything right now and look at Afghanistan and the plight of refugees that is both present and about to occur. Um, this Fred Rogers had a good line about, when there's trouble, look for the helpers.
Mm.
Um, and so kind of seeking out better stories, so that we don't just focus on what's wrong and what's broken, can make it easier to feel like we've got room to help. And I think that's going to be a very important thing going forward so that we don't feel crushed by how enormous the problems are, whether it's refugees and suffering or COVID related suffering or climate change. It's about avoiding paralysis, I think.
I think, Vicky, that was beautifully said. Oh, I feel like, okay, we can close here because that was very, very well articulated and absolutely spot on. Um, so what is one story that inspired you in all this crush?
Um, you're going to laugh because you sent me a possible list of questions, and I was thinking, what's the story? And then you asked, what's one book we should read? And I'm going to combine those two, um, because the book tells a story.
Mm.
I have a 6-year-old and a 2-year-old. I spend a lot of time reading children's books. There are good lessons in them. If your listeners have never read the book The Rabbit Listened,
Mm.
I highly recommend that, by Corey Dorfeld. I think it applies to every stage of life and is very wise.
Mm.
It's about a kid who builds a fantastic tower and it gets knocked down. And all these animals come to tell the kid what to do about it, that they should rebuild, they should get mad, they should get angry, they should knock down someone else's tower. And finally, the rabbit just comes and sits next to the sad kid and just sits and waits until the kid wants to talk, until Taylor wants to talk. And then the rabbit just listens as Taylor goes through all these steps and emotions to come to a place where Taylor is ready to rebuild.
Mm.
And then the rabbit's ready to celebrate it. And I think that there's a wonderful lesson in there for parents, for community leaders, for nonprofit leaders. Listen first. Listen to all the feelings and emotions when somebody's gone through something that broke them a little bit, and then be ready to stand by them and celebrate and aid as they think is helpful when they need to rebuild. And we're going to need to do that at family levels. We're going to need to do that at community levels as we move out of this. My sort of lesson for the year, I took comfort in it every time I read this book with my children. It was a good reminder. I want to be the rabbit who listens.
Mm.
And so I highly recommend that book to everybody.
That's a great story, Vicky. Thank you. I think
Yeah.
we all have sort of a preference for action, which is not the right thing most of the times. We just want support, and everyone's fully capable of solving their own problems, but we want the support. So
Absolutely. And if any of your listeners would like to have a look at the report, if they go to New America's website, newamerica.org, and type in Underconnected, they'll find the full project page. There's the full report. There's reports from the focus groups, and there's also a nice 2-page document that is intended for nonprofit leaders and school leaders who want to identify who's underconnected in their communities. The first page tells you how to use the questions, and the second page you could just send out to families so that you can identify who's going to need help in circumstances where learning is remote, for example, and identify them in a better way than just asking questions about access. So
for
I
sure,
hope that
and,
that's
and
something
that
that might be helpful. Yeah,
that's super helpful. When I saw that, I was like, yes, because all of these times the questions are always kept back, and then we need them, right? So
absolutely.
thank you, Vicky. That was inspiring, nourishing, rejuvenating on so many different levels. And thank you for doing the work that you're doing. And like you said, focusing on this area is so in need of studying, and that's not a very good thing. But these are amazing, bright spots that you're building for us. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me and for all the work that you're doing with girls and children and families. I'm so grateful to be here with you.
Likewise. All right. Thank you everyone for tuning in. And join us next week for an example of connected learning and also how a collective impact of a community helps families. So thank you everyone. Have a good weekend.